Welcome to the second commentary of our little trilogy here of video commentaries about the uncanny, the grotesque, and abjection. This one is about Mikhail Bakhtin and his concept of the grotesque. Okay, so first off, a few biographical notes about Mikhail Bakhtin. He was born in Ural, Russia in 1895, and he died in Moscow in the USSR in 1975, so he came a little bit later than our previous subject, Sigmund Freud, but he's still pretty much wedged into modernism. He's perhaps best known for his radical philosophy of language, as well as his theory of the novel, underpinned by concepts such as dialogism, polyphony, and carnival, themselves resting on the more fundamental concept of heteroglossy. So these all kind of have to do with a kind of diversity of voices, of ideological viewpoints, as the driving forces of certain novels, such as those of Dostoevsky, of whom he wrote a whole book about, as well as Francois Rabelais, who we'll get to in a few moments. And Bakhtin's writings, they were produced at a time of momentous upheavals in Russia. There was the revolution of 1917, which was followed by a civil war. There was famine, and then eventually the dark years of repressive dictatorship under Joseph Stalin. But these early revolutions, they kind of ushered in the end of the Tsarist Russia, and then in turn the rise of Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. And the Bolsheviks would later become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This would lead to the Soviet Union becoming a major world power, and eventually, after the World Wars into the Cold War, kind of contender with the U.S. So there's all this political strife going on. And Bakhtin, throughout his life and work, would frequently find himself in conflict with the changing governments and the political situation, such as it was. So much so that he would eventually be sentenced to 6 years of internal exile in Kazakhstan, and he was sent to Kazakhstan instead of the sort of wasteland, the Gulag wasteland of Siberia, because he had ill health that was rooted in a bone disease that he had, a degenerative bone disease that would eventually lead to him needing to have his leg amputated. So he eventually had one of his legs cut off. During World War II, Bakhtin lived in Moscow, and there he submitted a dissertation. But because of the war, he would not be able to defend his dissertation until the end of the war. So he submitted this in the attempt to get a doctorate. The subject of this dissertation was the works of the French Renaissance writer Francois Rabelais, we will discuss in a second. In 1946 and 1949, when Bakhtin could finally defend his dissertation, it proved to be highly divisive amongst the scholars of Moscow. Apart from being a generally unorthodox manuscript, one of the key points of contention was his positive valuation of the role of carnival as a temporary suspension of social order and licentious behavior. So he was kind of praising the practice of carnival as a temporary upheaval of the political powers, of the dominant political powers. The government would eventually intervene in these disputes that the scholars were having about Bakhtin's work, and his doctorate was denied ultimately, though he did receive a lesser degree from the State Accrediting Bureau. So in a certain way, this book, Rabelais and His World, which was the result of Bakhtin's dissertation, it was pretty much suppressed by the political powers of the time. So again, Rabelais and His World, this was basically developed from this dissertation that Bakhtin had submitted in order to get his doctorate, but it would eventually become a book, and it would gain prominence in later decades as certain academics and scholars and translators brought it to a wider audience in other parts of Europe and beyond. The subject of Rabelais and his world is Francois Rabelais, who was a Renaissance humanist writer. And he was a priest. He was known in his time as an eminent physician and humanist. And later on, he's still remembered as the author of comic masterpiece Gargantua and Pantagruel, which is basically 4 novels about these 2 giants. Gargantua is Pantagruel's father, and right here, so this is Rabelais, and this is a picture of. I'm actually not sure which giant this is a picture of. It's either Gargantua or his son Pantagruel. But most 3 out of the 4 of these novels are about Pantagruel, who is a giant. His name Pantagruel means all thirst. So these novels, these Renaissance novels, are really sort of recognized as embodying the spirit of Carnival, right? So these novels, they have a very complex language. They're written in French, but they employ a lot of other languages in them. Rabelais was a highly educated man, and there's a diversity of language. There's made up words in there. There's a lot of wordplay and games. So these are very hard books to translate for the complexity of language and to carry that humor over, that comedy, which is so frequently deeply rooted in the language. And the comedy of it ranges from gross burlesque to profound satire. So there's a lot of kind of what we might call risque or dirty. There's a lot of dirty jokes mixed in with kind of very, as I said, educated, learned satire. There's a lot of references to philosophers of his day, and then all the way going back to the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans and all this. He exploits popular legends in these books, farces and romances, as I said, and that's classical and Italian material. But they were written primarily for a court public, an upper class, essentially, right? A learned one, a sector of the population that had time to get a really thorough education. And we still use the adjective Rabelaisian today. A lot of people apply it to kind of dirty humor, sort of flamboyant, dirty humor, but that's not entirely appropriate to use just because something is scatological or dirty or makes a lot of jokes about sex and farts and whatnot. You can't call it Rabelaisian just because of that. He uses it in a very complex way. Aesthetically, it's not just gratuitous. It's all part of the satire. It's all part of reflecting, and in Bakhtin's eyes, it's reflecting the spirit of his time, the spirit of the common people, the common man. So his creative exuberance is colorful. It's his wide-ranging vocabulary and literary variety that continue to ensure his popularity to today. And a lot of that might be due in part to Bakhtin's analysis of Rabelais. Okay, so the main thing that comes out of Bakhtin's book, Rabelais and His World, is this whole theory of the carnivalesque. It's all rooted in Bakhtin's broader theories of dialogism, heteroglossia, and the idea of the polyphonic novel, as opposed to a monologic novel, which is written with one philosophical viewpoint, one ideological viewpoint, as opposed to a diversity of contrasting ideologies and philosophies and voices that are producing the novel and the dramatic tension through their contrast. And I've selected this picture from Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame because I think it's something that at least some of you might be familiar with. So I'm using that as a starting point. But it's actually not a bad introduction to the concept of carnival, It's based on Victor Hugo's classic novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and early on in it, there's the Feast of Fools, where Quasimodo gets crowned the King of Fools, and there's this whole musical number about Topsy Turvy Day, right? So this is kind of the family watered down version of it, but we still get, in the abstract, we still get the basic elements. Even some of the potential cruelty of Carnival, right? The cruel laughter of it. Right, so in literature, the carnivalesque literary mode parallels the flouting of authority and temporary inversion of social hierarchies that in many cultures are permitted during a season of carnival. So Bakhtin's positive valuation of this is kind of what got him in trouble with the political powers and some of these other scholars that wanted to suppress his work and not validate it by giving him a doctorate. The literary work does so by introducing a mingling of voices from diverse social levels that are free to mock and subvert authority. So this is where we get Bakhtin's connection of carnival to these other ideas he has of dialogism and heteroglossia, these conflicting ideologies as the dramatic backbone of any novel. To flout social norms by ribaldry and to exhibit various ways of profaning what is ordinarily regarded as sacrosanct, right? So if you can take anything away from that song, Topsy Turvy Day from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Disney version, if you've seen it, it's that everything in Carnival is kind of turned upside down and inside out. It's topsy turvy, right? So let that be kind of a mnemonic device for you to remember this idea of Carnival. The holy is brought low, the low is brought to the top. The king is a peasant, the peasant is a king. Up is down, ugly is beautiful, so on and so forth. And also, Bakhtin is examining how the works of Francois Rabelais parallel Carnival as it was practiced in medieval times. But it's worth noting that we still see Carnival being carried out today. We see it in Mardi Gras in New Orleans, Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, and then Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago. We even see like Juve in Brooklyn that we have every year, right? Carnival. So the carnival, the expression, the word comes from carnevale, which in Latin means farewell to the flesh, and it was really a time of preparing for Lent, and that's what Mardi Gras is. Mardi Gras means Fat Tuesday. It's basically a time of indulgence and earthliness before the spiritual renewal of Lent, of fasting and prayer and so on and so forth. But refrain from eating meat. So carnevale, farewell to the flesh. Carnival precedes Lent, and during Lent, you refrain from eating meat, but there's also supposed to be a shift of focus to the spiritual, right? So even though like Juve in Brooklyn, that doesn't take place right before Lent, but it still reflects the spirit of Carnival. It still does the same thing that Carnival does, which is this sort of temporary upheaval, this upside down, this celebration, this ribaldry, this sort of turning inside out of society for a day or a couple of days at least. Now, one of the key components of Bakhtin's theory of the Carnivalesque is the concept of the grotesque, which was originally applied to a style of mosaic and fresco wall paintings from ancient Rome. And it was rediscovered in the late 15th century during an excavation of the Emperor Nero's Golden House. So they did an archaeological dig, or they found these sort of paintings, which were arabesques with floral, animal, and human elements in a whimsically ornamental mode, which you can sort of see here. This is an example. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the ornate arabesques, and in the figures in here, some kind of horse creature, and then it looks like a merman or something, right? or a genie, but almost monstrous. It's whimsical, it's fantastical, it's fantasy, it's in the realm of fantasy, it's not realism, it's not realistic, it's out there, right? It's something outside of the ordinary. The word itself comes from grotesca, which is Italian for grotto. Grotesca, grotto, grotesque. And that's because in this dig, the space of this excavation where Nero's golden house was, it resembled a grotto, which is like a cave, like a small cave, especially a man-made cave, right? But eventually this style would be picked up on and extended and expanded upon by Raphael and other painters of the Italian Renaissance. And the grotesque, such as it was then, it filled marginal spaces, borders of paintings or ceilings and pilasters. And it seems to me that there's something really appropriate about that, about how these images, these grotesque images, filled the marginal spaces, especially if we are applying it to monsters and their place in society, which is really on the margins, right? So monsters are shoved aside to the fringes of society. So the term itself, grotesque, it would increasingly be used to describe other artistic forms that combine incongruous elements, such as many forms of medieval Christian art and architecture, including depictions of hell, the temptations of St. Anthony, the gargoyles and monsters of Romanesque and Gothic church architecture, and the extravagant, even sometimes vulgar and comic designs surrounding devotional texts and illuminated manuscripts. Right. So you can see here there's an image of the Hellmouth with this kind of monstrous creature with his fangs here swallowing all these people down into hell. The top right, you'll see the temptation of St. Anthony, where he's having these hallucinations of demons. The bottom right, you see a gargoyle. And then the bottom left, you can see kind of this dirty little picture, this dirty little cartoon, which would be in a book, a manuscript. So an illuminated manuscript would be like an illustrated book. Most of the time, it would be monks making these. And then finally, up to our contemporary age, the term grotesque now is generally used to refer to anything unnatural, strange, absurd, ludicrous, distorted, wildly fantastic, or bizarre, such as this very disturbing picture here, this sculpture, which can definitely be called grotesque for a number of reasons. But it's certainly strange, absurd, ludicrous, distorted, wildly fantastic, and bizarre. But Bakhtin attributes very specific qualities to his conception of the grotesque. And this, to a certain degree, separates his usage from the broad strokes of the current usage, as we generally use it in the everyday. When Bakhtin says that the grotesque is concerned with time, he means that it reflects and is informed by the cycles of nature, the changes that occur throughout the seasons of life in the natural environment. In the artistic evolution of the grotesque, it begins to also incorporate historic and social cycles, such as, for example, the wheel of fortune from rags to riches. So the road to success and the road to failure are symbolically jumbled up in the grotesque image. By ambivalence, Bakhtin means that the grotesque is not imbued with a single emotion, but exists where emotional opposites overlap and mingle. So a grotesque image might be adorational and debasing at once, and might be both loving and angry, both joyful and frightening. The grotesque image is formed around internal contradictions. For our purposes, this means creatures at odds with themselves, especially when that manifests physically. We are, after all, talking about the body and form here, which represent, in their own turn, when in art, the body and form represent socially mental states. In this introduction to his book Rabelais and His World, Bakhtin illustrates this contradictoriness with the image of pregnant death. In the grotesque image, birth constantly undermines death and vice versa. More than two sides of the same coin, each is contained in each. From decay, there comes new growth. And there is again deep connection to the earth here and natural cycles. The soil from which flowers grow in the spring is produced from dead matter and bodily wastes. The grotesque image exists in an unstable state of metamorphosis. It is incomplete, fragmented, uncertain. The grotesque body exists between two complete states and is not easy to categorize. Bakhtin contrasts this with the classical conception of beauty, which celebrates harmony, unity, completeness, like the aesthetics of the ancient Greeks. In opposition to that, in the grotesque body, there is an emphasis and an exaggeration of the parts of the body that extend into the external world and through which the external world enters. So things like noses, mouths, potbellies, breasts, genitals, and butts, anal cavities, anal openings. These are enlarged, heightened, and highlighted, praised even. The focus is on the lower faculties, the earthly faculties. So eating, drinking, pissing, shitting, and sex, as opposed to more upward ambitions towards spiritual perfection. The grotesque body is deeply connected to the earth, deeply connected to the soil and material nature. The sacred is debased, and the profane applauded and praised. To Bakhtin, the grotesque also informs certain uses of abusive language, curses, and oaths. But he's not talking about foul language when it's used in a cruel way here. He's talking about when it's used to connect people socially, when it is ambivalent and meant to be funny. Like if you call your friend a dirty word when joking around, I'm sure we've all done this, right? We all insult our friends, and in turn they insult us, perhaps, but in a friendly manner. We know that it's a joke. So even though the word itself sounds mean, there's an understanding that unites you together in the humor and the groundedness of it and the teasing of each other and the laughter that results from it and the kind of debasing, that it brings us together in the humbleness of life and the humbleness of humanity. When it's used in good cheer, abusive language can be fun. It can be uniting. It can be inclusive. Just so the grotesque image is of a playful, a manipulated, a monstrous body, removed from commonplace social restraints. So even though it could be a monster, right, we might generally associate the emotional fear with the monster, but the carnivalesque, grotesque monster, such as Bakhtin imagines, such as Bakhtin theorizes about, it wouldn't just be scary, it would also be funny. And the laughter is a way of overcoming the fear that we might face when presented with the monstrous, right? So you can kind of see it in these paintings here. The lower one is by Hieronymus Bosch, and the top one is by a follower of his who sort of imitated his style, possibly working off of an initial sketch of Mr. Bosch's. But you can see these sort of demons, they're dancing around, they're in hell, there's knives severing ears from nothing between them. They're bloody, they're violent, but there's also this wild, weird humor to them, right? So they're not purely terrifying. There's laughter, and then that keeps us absorbed in them, and it has kept people absorbed in them now for centuries because of that. There's something almost sublime in it. You get lost. You don't have a central focus. The whole thing, obviously it's a painting and it's fixed, but it keeps you guessing. There's this sense of movement, this sense of that it's always changing, this sense of constant metamorphosis. And there's this duality, at least a duality, of emotional responses that one might have to it. It's at once frightening and funny. It's at once warm and violent, right? So it's grotesque in the true sense, according to Bakhtin. But grotesque in both the broad sense indicated by its current general usage, the way we use it on a day-to-day, and as specifically articulated by Bakhtin, it's an essential ingredient in many a monster, including some we shall be reading about very soon. Okay, so that's basically it for this commentary on Bakhtin and the grotesque. Stay tuned for one more on Julia Kristeva and her concept of abjection. And then that will complete our trilogy of video commentaries on these three concepts. But there will be more video commentaries to come throughout the semester on other matters, possibly incorporating these three concepts. So make sure that you know them very well. Okay, see you soon. Bye.